Hello, everyone. I'm curious, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It's fascinating to imagine the corners of the world where someone is settling in to hear this story. My name is Carl Weber, and I work in a place that few people ever imagine exists. A place hidden behind layers of secrecy and guarded doors. A place where the air always smells faintly of chemicals and heated metal, and the hum of machinery never truly stops, even at night. I've walked these corridors countless times, yet each day brings something new, some experiment that seems to push the boundaries of science and reason, and sometimes the limits of human decency. The laboratory itself is vast, more complex than a single building, with concrete walls that feel impossibly thick and doors reinforced with steel, each one watched by men whose expressions never change, whose eyes seem to miss nothing. Even when the hallways are empty, there is a feeling of being observed, a silent tension that presses down on anyone who steps through the entrance. I still remember the first time I entered the main hall, the smell of burning metal, the faint odor of formaldehyde, the metallic clang of machines adjusting themselves as if alive, all mingling into an atmosphere that is almost suffocating in its intensity. My day begins before the sun rises, with the corridors illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that make every surface gleam too brightly, reflecting off polished floors and glass instruments like a warning that nothing is allowed to remain hidden. Today, as I walked past the long rows of tables cluttered with glass vials and intricate devices whose purposes are known only to a few, I noticed the technicians moving quietly, each one performing tasks that look simple on the surface but could have consequences far beyond what any of us could predict. The hum of electricity runs through the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a generator thrums, keeping the environment tightly controlled. In one corner, a set of machines is being recalibrated, gears clicking rhythmically, while a small cage houses an animal, its presence almost forgotten amidst the mechanical chaos. Rumors circulate that some of these tests are no longer just about materials or engines, that the lines between chemistry, biology, and something far more unsettling are beginning to blur, but such topics are whispered only behind closed doors, never recorded, never discussed openly. As I move down the hallway, my boots echo against the concrete floor, a sound that seems impossibly loud in the otherwise quiet labyrinth of the lab. I catch glimpses of the scientists around me, their faces pale and drawn, some scribbling notes so intensely that they do not notice the world beyond their benches, others simply staring at experiments as if willing them to succeed, to finally achieve the impossible. The projects are varied and strange. Some involve propulsion systems designed to defy conventional physics, others chemical compounds that glow faintly, as though hinting at a power contained within that could be dangerous if misused. There is a peculiar charm in the meticulous order of everything, from the careful labeling of flasks to the precise arrangement of instruments that no outsider could ever comprehend. And yet, the entire place carries a weight, an unspoken tension, the sense that behind every locked door, something is being tested, observed, perhaps experimented upon in ways that are meant to be invisible to the outside world. Even I, who have walked these halls for months, sometimes feel that there are corners of the lab that no one has yet dared to explore, spaces filled with machinery that hums with secrets older than any of us. Outside the windows, the world is waking slowly, the first rays of sunlight struggling through the gray haze of the early morning, barely touching the top of the lab's walls. Inside, however, the work never pauses, and the air seems to vibrate with an energy that is almost alive. It is in this tension, this constant mixture of curiosity and fear, that I find myself drawn deeper into the mysteries of the laboratory, knowing that each step, each observation, each careful note I record could be a piece of a puzzle that no one outside will ever see, and perhaps, one day, a piece that will define history in ways that are far beyond my imagination. And yet, as I stand at the threshold of the central wing, peering into the dimly lit expanse of machines, glass, and shadow, I cannot help but feel a mix of anticipation and dread. There are whispers about projects that have gone terribly wrong, stories of flames, smoke, and instruments that behaved in ways no one could predict. But whether these are exaggerations or truth, no one speaks openly. All I know is that behind each door lies a world where science flirts dangerously with the unknown, and where I, Carl Weber, have chosen to walk day after day with only my curiosity, my notes, and my own uneasy conscience as companions. As the morning hum of the laboratory settled into a steady rhythm, I made my way to the eastern wing, where one of the earliest experiments of the day was about to begin. The room was vast, filled with tables covered in glassware that gleamed like frozen light, wires snaking across the floor like living vines, and instruments whose purposes I often guessed but never fully understood. The lead scientist, a tall man named Dr. Fisher, moved with quiet precision, adjusting a series of valves and dials, his eyes scanning the gauges as if reading the heartbeat of some invisible entity. I lingered at the edge of the room, notebook in hand, prepared to record observations that might later be forgotten, dismissed, or hidden. The experiment itself was deceptively simple at first glance. A reaction between a volatile chemical compound and a metallic alloy designed to produce a controlled chain reaction. Yet the subtle adjustments, the careful timing, and the exact measurements required revealed the delicate dance of precision and unpredictability that governed this laboratory. I watched as a small vial was tipped, the contents spilling into a shallow basin, the liquid hissing and curling like a living creature. A faint green glow began to emerge, casting ghostly reflections on the stainless steel surfaces, and for a moment, it seemed that the entire room held its breath. Rumors among the junior staff suggested that not all experiments were this benign. Some claimed that previous tests had resulted in fires that left scorched marks on the walls or fumes that caused days of illness. Others whispered about machines that produced unexpected radiation, forces that no one could predict, and about scientists who had vanished into the labyrinthine corridors, never to be seen again. Whether these stories were true or mere tales to unsettle newcomers, I could not tell, but the tension in the air was unmistakable, a silent pressure that made every careful step feel consequential. Dr. Fisher made a subtle gesture, and an assistant carefully adjusted a dial, causing the reaction to accelerate. The liquid began to bubble more vigorously, small sparks dancing along its surface like fleeting stars. I jotted down every movement, every sound, trying to capture the rhythm of the experiment as if transcribing a symphony only audible to those who knew how to listen. Around me, the other scientists remained absorbed in their work, some noting observations, others merely observing, eyes glinting with the same mixture of excitement and trepidation that I felt. As the minutes stretched, the reaction took on an unpredictable pattern. A sudden flare of light, brief but intense, reflected off the polished walls, causing me to step back instinctively. The assistants exchanged quick, tense glances, communicating through subtle nods and gestures honed over months of working in this charged environment. It was here, in these small moments, that the laboratory truly revealed itself, not merely as a collection of machines and chemicals, but as a living, breathing organism, responsive, temperamental, and infinitely mysterious. Between the hum of machinery and the soft clinking of glass, I overheard fragments of conversation. Some spoke of potential military applications, some of theoretical possibilities that could revolutionize energy production, and others whispered doubts, questions about ethics that were quickly cut short by a stern look or a shift in the topic. In this place, curiosity was both a gift and a danger, and one had to navigate the fine line between exploration and transgression with careful awareness. By the time the experiment reached its controlled conclusion, the room was quiet, save for the residual hiss of cooling metals and the soft tapping of notes being scribbled into ledgers. The glow faded, leaving behind a faintly iridescent residue, and Dr. Fisher nodded with a mixture of relief and satisfaction, signaling that the day's first success had been achieved without incident. Yet even as I prepared to move on to my next observation, I could not shake the feeling that each reaction, no matter how carefully executed, was but a small glimpse into a world whose depths were only partially understood, a world where the pursuit of knowledge could be as perilous as it was exhilarating. Outside, the sun had risen fully, casting long shadows across the corridors, but inside the laboratory, the light seemed both sharper and colder, highlighting every detail of the meticulous chaos that surrounded us. And I, Carl Weber, moved forward, notebook in hand, aware that every observation, every note, every subtle interaction was another thread woven into the intricate, often dangerous tapestry of this secretive place. A place where science and ambition collided in ways that were impossible to predict, yet impossible to resist. As the day progressed, the rhythm of the laboratory became more apparent, a cadence dictated not by the outside world, but by the steady pulse of experiments, machines, and the subtle movements of those who worked within its walls. It was easy for someone unfamiliar to imagine that this place existed solely for cold, scientific purposes, but the truth was far more complex. There was life here, though it existed within strict boundaries, and the nuances of daily routine often revealed more about human nature than any experiment ever could. Breakfast in the laboratory's small canteen was a quiet affair. The room was narrow, tables lined in precise rows, with pale light filtering through small windows high above. Food was simple: coarse bread, thin slices of cold meat, and a bitter coffee that most of us drank more out of necessity than enjoyment. Conversations were muted, whispers mostly, the weight of secrecy pressing down on everything. I sat with a few colleagues, and though we exchanged words about the day's tasks, there was always an unspoken understanding that some topics were forbidden, that curiosity had limits, and that the wrong question could unsettle the wrong person. Despite the tension, there were small routines that brought a sense of normalcy. Technicians polished instruments meticulously, almost ritualistically, while others cataloged chemicals with obsessive care. Occasionally, someone would drop a small object, a vial or a tool, and the soft clink against the floor would echo across the room like a reminder of the precision required to survive in this environment. Even the slightest mistake could cascade into disaster, a lesson that everyone learned quickly, whether through observation or whispered cautionary tales. Lunch was slightly livelier, though never loud. I remember one day when Dr. Muller, a pale, thin man with spectacles sliding down his nose, recounted a rumor he had heard about a distant laboratory where an experiment had gone catastrophically wrong, filling the building with smoke and forcing evacuation. The story was hushed, but the fascination in the room was palpable, a mixture of horror and curiosity. We spoke of chemical reactions, unusual compounds, and theoretical machines, but the conversation always returned to the delicate balance of control and chaos that defined our daily existence. Life inside the complex extended beyond the canteen. There were hallways lined with offices, storage rooms filled with meticulously organized materials, and workspaces that seemed alive with quiet energy. Some rooms were barely larger than closets, yet housed machines of incredible complexity, humming with a steady, almost sentient sound. I often wandered these corridors during breaks, noting the subtle differences in lighting, the faint smells of different chemicals lingering in the air, and the way shadows shifted across instruments, giving the impression that the laboratory itself was watching, waiting. Evenings brought a subtle shift in atmosphere. The bright fluorescent lights dimmed slightly, and the distant hum of machines became more pronounced as fewer people remained at work. Some colleagues would linger, reviewing notes or recalibrating instruments, while others retired to their sparse quarters, reading, writing, or quietly contemplating the strange, often morally ambiguous work we performed. The conversations at these hours were more candid, though still careful, touching on fears, ambitions, and occasional glimpses of humor that seemed incongruous in such a controlled environment. I remember one night particularly vividly when I found myself in the central corridor after most of the staff had departed. The shadows stretched long and thin, the faint creak of a vent echoed like a footstep, and I could see the flickering glow of an experimental chamber down the hall. In that moment, the laboratory revealed its true duality. Part scientific marvel, part eerie, almost sentient organism, containing both the promise of knowledge and the persistent reminder of the risks that accompanied it. It was a delicate ecosystem, maintained by strict routines, careful observation, and an ever-present awareness that one misstep could alter the course of an experiment or a life forever. Through these daily routines, small interactions, and quiet observations, I began to understand not just the mechanics of the laboratory, but the lives of the people who inhabited it. Each scientist, technician, and assistant had their own methods of coping, their own rituals to maintain focus and sanity amidst secrecy and pressure. There were fleeting moments of camaraderie, shared smiles over minor victories, and hushed laughter that briefly cut through the tension. Yet beneath it all, the undercurrent of secrecy, danger, and the unknown remained, an invisible presence threading through every corner, every machine, every whispered word, shaping the life within the laboratory in ways that were subtle, pervasive, and impossible to ignore. And so, as I returned to my workspace, notebook in hand, I realized that the laboratory was more than just a place of experiments. It was a living chronicle of human curiosity, fear, and ambition. A place where every detail, every movement, and every interaction contributed to a vast, unfolding narrative that I was both participant in and witness to, a narrative that was as unpredictable as it was compelling. By midday, the hum of the laboratory seemed to resonate through every corridor, vibrating off the walls and mingling with the faint metallic scent that had become almost comforting to those of us who spent our lives within these hidden confines. I made my way to one of the smaller, more secluded wings of the complex, where a cluster of inventions sat under the careful scrutiny of engineers and scientists, their purposes often cryptic, their functions sometimes only partially understood. This section of the laboratory was a treasure trove of creativity mingled with obsession, a place where ideas collided with the edges of reality, producing devices that seemed more like fantasies brought to life than practical tools. One of the first machines I encountered resembled a small, metallic spider, with legs jointed at precise angles, each movement calculated and deliberate. It scuttled across the polished floor with a soft whirring sound, its body housing a maze of gears, wires, and coils that pulsed faintly as if the device were breathing. Engineers watched it closely, noting each step, adjusting tension on minuscule cables, speaking in low, urgent tones that carried a mixture of pride and apprehension. Rumors suggested that such machines were intended to explore hazardous areas or to test mechanisms too dangerous for human hands, though the true potential remained a closely guarded secret, known only to those authorized to touch the controls. Nearby, a peculiar contraption occupied the attention of another team, a glass chamber encased in a network of pipes and valves, where strange liquids flowed in looping circuits, glowing with hues that seemed impossible outside the laboratory's controlled environment. The liquids shimmered like liquid starlight, changing colors as they interacted with unseen catalysts, producing soft, almost musical bubbles that made the entire apparatus seem alive. I watched for a long time, noting the way each scientist adjusted the flow, the temperature, the subtle vibrations that indicated the experiment was progressing, or possibly teetering on the brink of failure. In a distant corner, a series of metallic wings, folded and gleaming under the dim lights, suggested attempts at flight far beyond conventional designs. Blueprints lined the walls, intricate sketches filled with calculations, annotations, and cryptic symbols that hinted at aerodynamic experiments meant to push the limits of physics. Occasionally, a small prototype would twitch or move slightly, the result of carefully calibrated motors testing balance and stability, and I could not help but wonder at the ambition driving these creations, ambitions that seemed to straddle the line between genius and madness. I overheard discussions about potential military applications, devices capable of reconnaissance, transportation, even weapons, each conversation laced with an urgency that hinted at the stakes beyond the laboratory walls. Yet there was also an almost childlike curiosity in some of the discussions, a fascination with what could be done, a desire to explore, to create, to achieve the impossible regardless of whether the world outside understood or approved. The tension between innovation and ethical restraint was palpable, a constant undertone that influenced every decision, every adjustment, every observation. One machine particularly caught my attention. A small, cube-shaped apparatus covered in switches and dials, pulsing softly with an inner light. No one spoke much about it. It was considered too unpredictable to allow casual discussion. I approached cautiously, notebook in hand, scribbling observations about its mechanical rhythms, the subtle heat it emitted, and the eerie way its components seemed almost to respond to the presence of people nearby. Later, whispers suggested that it was part of an experiment to harness energy in ways that defied conventional understanding, possibly even bordering on the impossible, though no one outside the inner circle could confirm or deny its function. Walking back through the corridors after hours of observation, I reflected on the sheer scope of innovation within the laboratory. Every device, every experiment, every blueprint represented a meticulous attempt to push the boundaries of knowledge, yet each also carried a risk of failure, of catastrophe, or of moral compromise. It was in this delicate interplay of ambition and caution that the laboratory truly revealed its character, a place where the human mind and mechanical ingenuity danced together, teetering on the edge of both brilliance and danger. As I returned to my workstation, notebook filled with sketches and notes, I realized that each invention was more than a mere tool. Each was a story, a fragment of the laboratory's living narrative, a testament to the unyielding curiosity that drove us, and the shadows of uncertainty that reminded us daily of the precariousness of our pursuit. And in that quiet reflection, I understood that the laboratory, for all its complexity and secrecy, was not merely a place of work. It was a world unto itself, governed by its own rhythms, rules, and silent judgments, a world in which I, Carl Weber, had become both observer and participant. The laboratory, despite its ordered corridors and gleaming machinery, held a persistent undercurrent of danger, a truth I had felt more than once but had never fully experienced, until that morning. I had been walking down the western wing, notebook tucked under my arm, observing a new chemical reaction that involved volatile compounds whose behavior was notoriously unpredictable. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and faint metallic tangs, and the low hum of the ventilation system seemed almost deafening in its constancy. Around me, colleagues moved with their usual precision, adjusting instruments and recording observations, seemingly unaware of the subtle shift in the atmosphere that preceded the incident. It began with a minor miscalculation. An assistant, younger and less experienced than the rest, had misread a gauge, allowing pressure to build slightly higher than intended within a sealed chamber. At first, the deviation was imperceptible, a faint hiss escaping through a vent, quickly masked by the constant chorus of machinery. I noticed it because the air felt heavier, and the subtle vibration of the floor seemed just a touch too intense. My curiosity compelled me closer, and I realized, almost simultaneously with Dr. Fisher, that something was about to go wrong. The reaction accelerated rapidly, faster than any of the simulations had predicted. The liquid inside the chamber churned violently, glowing with a white-hot intensity that reflected in the wide eyes of the nearby technicians. Sparks leapt from the machinery, and a high-pitched whine, like the scream of metal under strain, filled the room. For a moment, there was a stunned silence as everyone froze, torn between panic and the instinct to act. I could feel my heart pounding, a rhythmic drum against my ribs, as I realized that even a few seconds of hesitation could turn a controlled laboratory into a scene of disaster. Orders were shouted, sharp and precise. Hands moved in practiced synchrony, turning valves, redirecting power, and venting pressure as the chamber quaked under the strain. I recorded every detail in my notebook, each scribble a desperate attempt to capture the unfolding chaos before it consumed everything. Smoke began to curl along the edges of the room, thin at first, then thickening as the reaction continued unchecked. The bright, unnatural glow of the chemicals cast grotesque shadows across the faces of the scientists, highlighting fear, concentration, and a strange exhilaration that always seemed to accompany a narrowly avoided catastrophe. The assistant who had caused the error trembled, staring at the containment unit as though willing it to calm, his hands shaking despite attempts to remain functional. Dr. Fisher barked instructions, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip, directing others to stabilize the situation, prevent further escalation, and ensure that no one was harmed. In those moments, the meticulous routines that defined daily life in the laboratory became life-saving rituals, each precise motion holding the difference between survival and disaster. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only a matter of minutes, the reaction subsided. The chamber cooled, the glow faded, and the smoke dissipated, leaving behind a pungent tang of chemicals and the faint metallic taste of tension in the air. Silence fell, broken only by the quiet scribbling of notes and the heavy breathing of those who had survived the ordeal. I exhaled slowly, realizing that the room, which moments ago had seemed poised on the brink of destruction, had returned to its eerie calm, as if nothing had occurred at all. Yet everyone knew, deep down, that this incident would not be forgotten, that the delicate balance we maintained every day had been tested, and that the margin for error was narrower than ever. In the aftermath, whispers circulated among the staff. Some spoke of miracles in hushed tones. Others speculated about what could have happened had even a single adjustment failed. I noted each detail, every reaction, every glance, because these moments revealed the true character of the laboratory more than any experiment ever could. It was a place of brilliance, yes, but brilliance intertwined with constant danger. A place where knowledge and risk were inseparable partners, and where even the most minor misstep could have consequences far beyond what anyone could imagine. As I returned to my own work, notebook in hand, I reflected on the fragility of our existence here. The laboratory was not merely a site of scientific pursuit. It was a living, breathing entity, demanding vigilance, respect, and constant awareness. Every experiment, every instrument, every decision carried weight, and I, Carl Weber, had come to understand that in this world, the pursuit of knowledge was inseparable from the shadow of peril, and that each day was a delicate dance along the edge of the unknown. By late afternoon, the corridors of the laboratory seemed to stretch endlessly, shadows lengthening along polished floors and gleaming walls, and I found myself approaching a restricted wing I had rarely visited before. This section was reserved for one of the most ambitious projects of the entire complex, a prototype for what the higher-ups called the flying machine. Few had the clearance to enter, and even fewer had witnessed the experiment in action, but my role, though junior, occasionally required observation and note-taking under strict supervision. As I stepped into the room, the first thing that struck me was the sheer size of the device. It resembled a skeletal aircraft, its frame composed of intricate metal beams and complex linkages, with wings folded against the body like those of a colossal mechanical bird. Sheets of paper covered with diagrams and calculations were pinned across the walls, showing trajectories, wing articulation angles, and hypothetical propulsion methods, each note meticulous, precise, and yet hinting at a design that flirted dangerously with the boundaries of physics. The engineers moved around it cautiously, adjusting motors, tightening screws, and murmuring to themselves about balance, lift, and potential instability. Dr. Fisher, who had accompanied me, explained in low tones that the prototype was designed for reconnaissance, but the truth seemed far more ambitious. There was talk of achieving speed and altitude that conventional aircraft could not match, experiments with fuels and compressed gases that could produce sudden bursts of energy, and a constant fear that a single miscalculation could result in catastrophic failure. The tension in the room was palpable, the hum of nearby machinery blending with the almost imperceptible vibration of the prototype itself, as if it were alive and aware of our presence. The test began with a series of mechanical simulations. Wings extended slowly, guided by small motors, and the frame trembled under the pressure of each movement. Observers jotted notes feverishly, measuring angles, recording times, and comparing outcomes with the theoretical calculations on the charts. Sparks occasionally leapt from the joints where friction exceeded expectations, and I noted the anxious glances exchanged between engineers, a silent acknowledgement that every second of this experiment was a dance along the edge of disaster. I overheard snippets of conversation that hinted at the broader implications of the project. Some spoke in hushed tones about the possibility of reconnaissance flights deep into enemy territory, of gathering intelligence with a device capable of evading conventional detection. Others whispered fears that the technology could be weaponized in ways no one had fully anticipated, the line between surveillance and destruction growing ever thinner. The moral questions lingered in the background, unspoken yet omnipresent, shaping the tension in the room as profoundly as the mechanical challenges themselves. At one point, the prototype jolted unexpectedly. A valve had been misaligned, causing a minor burst of compressed air, enough to send a shiver through the entire structure. Engineers leapt into action, adjusting pressure, tightening fittings, and murmuring rapid calculations to each other, their hands moving with a precision born of both experience and fear. I scribbled notes furiously, capturing every detail, the way the machine shuddered and settled, the faint smell of ozone, the subtle vibrations transmitted through the floor. Each moment seemed to echo with the possibility of either brilliance or catastrophe. By evening, the prototype was returned to a stable state, wings folded neatly against its frame, motors silent for the time being. The room felt charged, alive with a strange mixture of relief, pride, and lingering unease. I realized that in this place, progress was inseparable from risk, and innovation always came with the potential for disaster. Walking back through the dim corridors toward my quarters, I reflected on the audacity of human ambition, on the delicate balance between discovery and destruction, and on the quiet, constant tension that defined life within this secretive, enigmatic laboratory. The flying machine, with its skeletal frame and trembling wings, remained in my mind long after I left the room, a symbol of the extraordinary, often perilous, efforts of those around me. Each experiment, each device, each precise adjustment was a testament to both genius and recklessness, and I understood more clearly than ever that this was a world where curiosity and danger walked hand in hand, shaping the fate of every observer, participant, and perhaps the course of history itself. Nightfall in the laboratory brought a shift unlike anything experienced during the day. The corridors, usually filled with a steady rhythm of machinery and muted conversations, grew quieter, the hum of electricity taking on an almost sentient quality as it reverberated along walls and floors. I stayed behind that evening, notebook in hand, drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease, wanting to witness the hidden life of the laboratory when most of its occupants had departed. The fluorescent lights overhead dimmed slightly, casting long, wavering shadows that made ordinary objects appear uncanny, and the silence was punctuated only by distant, mechanical clicks, the occasional hiss of cooling metal, and the soft scrape of an abandoned trolley. I wandered past the wings housing experimental devices, each machine seeming to take on a personality in the half-light. The mechanical spider from earlier scuttled along its track, its gears clicking softly, while the liquid-filled apparatus in the corner pulsed with an eerie, phosphorescent glow. I could hear faint whispers, though I was alone, the sound carried by the ventilation system or perhaps imagined by my own mind attuned to the tension of the night. Every creak, every subtle vibration, seemed amplified, each one a potential signal of something moving in the shadows, or a hint that the laboratory itself was alive in ways that defied reason. It was in the central chamber where the flying machine rested that I first noticed the anomaly. The prototype's faint internal lights flickered unexpectedly, as if responding to my presence, and a soft, rhythmic hum emerged from within its skeletal frame. I leaned closer, notebook poised, and realized that the sound did not align with any motor or mechanical function I understood. The machine seemed to breathe or pulse, a subtle vibration that I could feel under my fingertips when I cautiously approached. I noted every sensation, every fluctuation in light and sound, aware that any sudden movement might trigger alarms or worse. While inspecting the apparatus, I heard it, a faint shuffle from the far end of the hall. It was deliberate, not the erratic scuttle of machinery or the settling of the building. I froze, heart hammering, straining to distinguish between imagination and reality. Another shuffle followed, closer this time, and I glimpsed a shadow, a figure moving silently, almost gliding, along the edges of the light. My first instinct was to call out, but a sudden awareness of security protocols and potential consequences silenced me. Whoever or whatever was there remained unseen, yet their presence was undeniable. I retreated slowly, taking careful notes, documenting the flickers of light, the rhythmic hum, and the subtle movements that suggested life beyond what should exist in a room of machines. The laboratory, always unpredictable, seemed to assert itself more strongly at night, revealing mysteries and anomalies invisible during the structured order of daytime work. I considered that perhaps some of these occurrences were mechanical glitches, echoes of vibrations traveling through floors and walls, yet deep in my gut, I sensed that the laboratory had secrets far older and more intricate than I had realized. Hours passed in tense observation. I moved from one experimental wing to another, cataloging every subtle sound, every flicker of light, and every vibration underfoot. Shadows shifted in unnatural ways, machinery whispered with irregular cadence, and I began to piece together a pattern, a rhythm that belonged not to the devices alone, but to the laboratory as a whole. It felt alive, aware of its occupants, responsive in ways that were both fascinating and unnerving. By the time I finally returned to my quarters, notebook filled with observations and sketches, the first hints of dawn were breaking through the narrow windows. The corridors were empty, bathed in pale light, and the mechanical hum returned to its daytime cadence. I lay down briefly, reflecting on the night's events, aware that each observation had expanded my understanding of this enigmatic place, yet also deepened the sense of unease that accompanied life within the laboratory. There was brilliance here, innovation unlike anything the outside world could imagine, but it existed hand in hand with a subtle, omnipresent tension, a reminder that the boundaries between science, mystery, and danger were fragile and easily crossed. The morning after my night of observations carried a heavy sense of unease. Walking through the now familiar corridors, I overheard hushed conversations that made my stomach tighten. A mixture of curiosity, fear, and disbelief threaded through each whispered word. Rumors circulated among the assistants and junior technicians about experiments involving human subjects, clandestine tests that were never written in official logs and never acknowledged beyond the walls of the restricted wings. I paused by a doorway, pretending to adjust my notebook, while catching fragments of dialogue. Theories about endurance, physiological responses to extreme stress, and chemical trials that pushed boundaries I had never imagined crossing. I felt a chill as I continued my rounds. The laboratory's walls, always impersonal, seemed to press in, as though absorbing every whispered word and every step I took. My curiosity, however, outweighed my fear. I had to see for myself to understand the extent of what was happening, though I knew that doing so risked not only my position but potentially my life. The air smelled faintly metallic, tinged with antiseptic, a combination that somehow made the fear and fascination swirl together in a tangible weight. Dr. Fisher, usually reserved in public, noticed my lingering near the corridor and gave me a subtle, unreadable glance. It was both a warning and an acknowledgement, a reminder that while curiosity was valuable, discretion was essential. I nodded, retreating slightly, yet my mind raced with the possibilities. Were the rumors true? Could these experiments, so secret, so carefully concealed, actually be taking place here, in this labyrinth of concrete and machinery? Later that day, I was called into a small office for documentation review. Among the official blueprints and chemical logs were subtle notations that suggested trials with biological responses, subtle shifts in procedures that hinted at observations being made beyond chemical reactions. I traced the annotations with my finger, my mind piecing together possibilities that sent a shiver down my spine. Some of the substances tested could only have effects on living tissue, and the careful, almost obsessive recording of physiological responses implied human, or at least mammalian, testing. I returned to my quarters that evening with an uneasy sense of responsibility. The laboratory, so brilliant and alive with innovation, held a shadowed underside, one where ethical boundaries were blurred in pursuit of knowledge and technological advancement. I had observed machines that pulsed as if alive, liquids that shimmered impossibly, and prototypes that seemed almost sentient, but the thought that human life itself might be part of the experiments added a gravity to every observation I had made. Despite my discomfort, I knew that leaving the laboratory or ignoring these signs was impossible. Each day, I recorded every detail, every whisper, every anomaly, knowing that the written account might someday be the only trace of what occurred within these walls. Yet even as I wrote, I questioned my role in this complex ecosystem. Observer, recorder, participant, and the line between documenting history and becoming complicit in its darker chapters blurred. The evening air grew colder as I moved through the corridors, shadows stretching across polished floors and machines resting in silent anticipation for the next day's experiments. The knowledge of what might be happening in secret chambers, coupled with the lingering tension of night observations, left me with a sense of moral weight I had never experienced. The laboratory was no longer merely a place of scientific curiosity. It had become a stage for human ambition, ethical compromise, and the profound consequences of secrets kept too long. By the time I lay down, notebook beside me, the hum of the laboratory seemed louder than ever, echoing through the walls and my mind alike. The whispers of human experiments, whether entirely true or partially imagined, had unsettled me in a way that no mechanical anomaly, chemical reaction, or prototype machine had ever managed. And I knew that as the days continued, as new experiments began, and as the laboratory revealed more of its hidden mechanisms, the delicate balance of curiosity, danger, and morality would continue to define life in this enigmatic place. The next morning, a tense atmosphere hung over the laboratory, thicker than usual, as if the previous night's whispers had seeped into the walls themselves. My task that day involved observation of the animal trials, a series of experiments designed to study reactions to chemicals and mechanical stressors before any consideration of human application. The small testing wing was quiet, illuminated by pale light that reflected off metal cages and glass containers. The air was tinged with a sharp odor, a mix of antiseptic, chemicals, and the subtle scent of fear that seemed to emanate from the animals themselves. I approached the first cage where a rabbit, seemingly calm, was being carefully prepared for a trial. Technicians in white coats moved with precision, adjusting small tubes that delivered minute doses of experimental compounds, recording physiological responses with meticulous attention. I took notes, sketching the layout of the apparatus and the positions of instruments, trying to remain detached. Yet every twitch of an ear or nervous movement of a paw reminded me that these were living beings, reacting in real time to forces I barely understood. In a nearby enclosure, a mechanical simulation involving rats tested behavioral responses to unpredictable environmental changes. Tiny lights flashed, small motors activated, and subtle chemical stimuli were introduced, prompting rapid movements, jumps, and cautious retreats from the test subjects. Observers recorded reactions with precision, noting heart rates, respiration, and subtle shifts in posture. I realized that every minute detail mattered. The difference of a fraction of a second, a millimeter of motion, could determine the accuracy of the entire experiment. While documenting, I overheard fragments of conversation that hinted at more extreme trials. Some animals were subjected to volatile chemical exposures that caused immediate physical reactions, muscle spasms, frantic movements, and in some cases, the need for rapid intervention to prevent fatal outcomes. The engineers and scientists moved efficiently, almost coldly, yet there was an unmistakable tension in the room, a silent acknowledgement that each step was a careful negotiation with forces that could easily spiral out of control. A particularly intense reaction occurred when a small experimental compound was introduced to a mouse. The liquid hissed as it made contact, reacting with the synthetic substrate in the cage, producing a brief, eerie glow. The mouse froze, eyes wide, and then scrambled in a panic as subtle sparks danced along the edges of the apparatus. Observers adjusted valves and switches rapidly, murmuring instructions and making rapid calculations. I recorded each movement, each sound, and each subtle shift in chemical behavior, aware that the margin between control and chaos was razor-thin. By afternoon, the trials concluded with a mix of relief and exhaustion. The animals were returned to quieter, more stable conditions, though the residue of tension lingered in the room like a palpable fog. I reflected on the duality of the laboratory's purpose, a site of unprecedented innovation and discovery, yet also a place where life, animal and potentially human, was weighed against the pursuit of knowledge, measured in reactions, observations, and outcomes that often bordered on the morally indefensible. Walking back through the long corridors, I noted the subtle changes in light and sound, the low hum of machinery, and the faint residual odors of chemicals and biological experiments. The laboratory was alive, in a way that went beyond mechanical processes, embodying both the brilliance and the shadow of human curiosity. And as I sat in my quarters that evening reviewing notes, sketches, and observations, I understood that the trials on animals were not merely preliminary. They were a reflection of the lengths to which ambition, secrecy, and the pursuit of knowledge could stretch the ethical boundaries of science. The events of the day lingered in my mind, haunting in their precision, complexity, and moral ambiguity. The laboratory, in all its mechanical brilliance and shadowed corridors, was more than a workplace. It was a microcosm of human ingenuity and imperfection, a living testament to the fine line between discovery and danger, ambition and consequence. Several days later, I stumbled upon a corridor I had not noticed before, a narrow passage partially concealed behind movable storage panels and rarely used for daily traffic. Curiosity, coupled with my ongoing sense of duty to document everything, compelled me to explore. The air grew colder, the faint metallic scent intensifying as I moved further in, and the soft hum of machinery from distant chambers became a more insistent presence, as though guiding me towards something deliberately hidden. At the end of the corridor, a heavy steel door bore no label, only a series of cryptic symbols scratched into the paint. I paused, noting its peculiar placement and the fact that no official schedule or task list had ever mentioned this wing. The lock mechanism was complex, but Dr. Fisher's earlier warnings about restricted areas had left me cautious, so I jotted the location in my notebook rather than forcing entry. Even standing outside, I could hear subtle noises from within, a rhythmic tapping, the low hiss of compressed gases, and an occasional metallic clang that suggested machinery far different from the experimental wings I was familiar with. Later that evening, after the laboratory had mostly emptied, I returned, determined to observe without entering. Shadows moved behind the thick, reinforced windows of the hidden wing, flickering light revealing shapes that were part machine, part something else entirely. I could see tables with instruments unlike any I had encountered. Small containment units with precise dials, devices connected by a web of pipes, and chemical apparatus that glowed with colors not found in nature. Occasionally, a shadowed figure passed among the tables, hands adjusting levers and knobs, eyes scanning gauges as if monitoring forces beyond human comprehension. Whispers from colleagues hinted at the purpose of this wing, though details were scarce and often contradictory. Some spoke of chemical synthesis beyond known limits, others of mechanical experiments meant to manipulate energy in ways that could defy conventional physics. More disturbing were murmurs about human trials, hinted at but never confirmed, and the sense that whatever occurred behind these doors was the most guarded secret in the entire laboratory. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a mixture of fascination and dread. The hidden wing was a realm of innovation and danger beyond anything I had previously witnessed. The sounds from within grew more pronounced that night. A soft, almost melodic whirring of a machine starting, a hiss of vapor escaping from sealed chambers, and faint clinks that suggested movement or adjustments. I scribbled furiously in my notebook, documenting patterns, sounds, and anything that might provide insight into the experiments occurring beyond the locked door. Each subtle vibration seemed amplified in the quiet of the empty corridors, creating an eerie rhythm, as though the wing itself were alive, observing my curiosity with silent intelligence. By dawn, I had recorded what I could from my vantage point. The hidden wing remained a mystery, a place of unspeakable experiments, intricate machinery, and the persistent sense of human ambition pushed to its most extreme limits. I realized that the laboratory was not simply a collection of rooms and devices. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of secrecy, experimentation, and risk. And within it, the hidden wing represented both the pinnacle of scientific achievement and the shadowed depths of ethical compromise. A space that could shape the future or consume those who dared to explore too closely. As I returned to the main corridors, notebook full, I understood that my role as observer was becoming ever more complex. Every note, every observation, and every subtle detail might one day tell a story not only of scientific genius but of the consequences of ambition unchecked. The hidden wing remained a constant presence in my mind, a reminder that the laboratory was far larger, more complex, and far more dangerous than any single experiment could reveal, and that the pursuit of knowledge often demanded walking the fine line between awe and fear, between discovery and peril. Several nights later, I returned to the hidden wing, notebook in hand, compelled by an irresistible mixture of curiosity and duty. The corridors were silent, dimly lit by the pale glow of overhead lights, and the air was heavy with the faint scent of chemicals, metallic and sharp, that seemed stronger in the absence of daytime activity. My footsteps echoed in a way that made me hyper-aware of every movement, every sound, and every shadow. As I approached the steel door, I noticed something unusual. A small indicator light, usually dull, was glowing brightly, suggesting that some experiment had recently been activated. Heart pounding, I crouched behind a nearby wall, observing through a narrow crack in the reinforced window. Inside, a strange device rested on a central table, its metallic arms slowly rotating, emitting soft clicks with each movement. A technician, presumably unaware of my presence, adjusted the controls with meticulous care, glancing occasionally at gauges and readouts. The air vibrated with the low hum of energy, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the floor and into my chest. Suddenly, an alarm blared. Not the standard warning system, but a sharp, high-pitched shriek that cut through the silence like a blade. The technician froze, eyes wide, then rushed to manipulate switches in a desperate attempt to stabilize the device. I stumbled back, heart hammering, barely avoiding a collision with a cart as the energy pulse inside the room intensified. Sparks danced along the edges of the apparatus, and the smell of ozone filled the corridor, making my eyes water. For a moment, it felt as if the entire laboratory was holding its breath, waiting to see if order or chaos would prevail. The technician managed to stabilize the device just in time, releasing a burst of energy that sent a shiver through the walls. I exhaled slowly, realizing how close I had been to becoming part of a catastrophe I could neither predict nor control. The incident left me shaken, acutely aware of the dangers inherent in these experiments and the razor-thin margin separating careful observation from disaster. Each second in the hidden wing was a delicate negotiation with forces I barely understood, and a single misstep could have catastrophic consequences. After the immediate danger passed, I noted every detail in my notebook: the sequence of alarms, the reactions of the technician, the patterns of energy pulses, and the subtle vibrations transmitted through the floor. Even as I wrote, I felt a lingering tension in my chest, a reminder that the laboratory's brilliance was inseparable from its inherent risk. The hidden wing, with its mysterious devices and high-stakes experiments, was not just a place of curiosity. It was a crucible where knowledge and danger intertwined in ways that demanded constant vigilance. By the time I retreated to my quarters, the adrenaline had subsided, replaced by a profound sense of awe and unease. I understood that the laboratory was more than a collection of machines and experiments. It was a living, unpredictable entity with secrets that could consume those who sought them too eagerly. That night, as I lay down, notebook beside me, I contemplated the precariousness of my position. Observer, chronicler, participant, and potential casualty, in a world where discovery and danger existed side by side. The following morning brought a sense of unease that clung to me like a shadow. While organizing notes from the previous night, I noticed a set of schematics partially hidden beneath official documentation. Sketches and annotations that hinted at something extraordinary, something deliberately obscured. The formulas were chemical in nature, but unlike anything I had seen in previous experiments. They contained combinations of compounds designed to react violently under precise conditions, producing energy releases that could not be fully contained by conventional equipment. Curiosity overpowered caution, and I began studying the diagrams closely. The annotations suggested meticulous testing, with each step carefully recorded, yet many symbols and shorthand notes were cryptic, requiring inference to understand. There were mentions of potential applications for propulsion, for illumination of energy beyond traditional sources, and even hints at chemical processes intended to influence biological systems. The complexity was staggering, and the risks implicit in the formula were obvious. One error could result in an explosion, contamination, or unintended reactions that no human had experienced. Later that day, I overheard Dr. Fisher and a small team discussing the formula in hushed tones. Their voices carried urgency, a mix of excitement and fear, as they debated whether the experiment could proceed without catastrophic consequences. Some argued that the potential benefits outweighed the risks. Others, in more cautious tones, warned of the unpredictability of such reactions and the possible moral implications of using the formula on living subjects. I recorded everything, carefully noting the dialogue, their gestures, the subtle tension between ambition and caution that hung in the air like an invisible weight. By evening, I found myself returning to the hidden wing, drawn by the compulsion to witness the formula's effects firsthand. The corridor was dimly lit, the air heavy with anticipation, and the familiar hum of machinery seemed amplified, vibrating through the floor and walls. Inside, a controlled chamber housed the chemical compounds, connected to intricate tubing, gauges, and containment devices designed to absorb and redirect energy. Observers moved with precision, monitoring every subtle change, eyes scanning the instruments like hawks. The experiment began cautiously. A small, controlled quantity of the formula was introduced into the reaction chamber. Almost immediately, a faint glow emerged, pulsing rhythmically, casting eerie reflections on the faces of the observers. Instruments began recording rapidly fluctuating data. Temperature spikes, energy pulses, and chemical transformations that defied expectations. The hum of machinery intensified, blending with a soft, almost musical vibration emanating from the chamber, as though the formula itself were alive, resonating with energy beyond ordinary comprehension. I watched, notebook in hand, fascinated and terrified. The room was filled with tension. Every observer was acutely aware of the delicate balance required to contain the reaction. One misstep, one adjustment too slow or too hasty, could unleash forces no one was prepared to manage. Sparks occasionally danced along the containment unit, instruments beeped and flickered, and I felt my pulse quicken as I documented every detail. The brilliance of the formula was undeniable, yet its danger was absolute, a constant reminder that human ambition could both illuminate and destroy. By the end of the session, the reaction had stabilized, the glow fading, and the room returning to its normal hum. Observers exchanged silent glances, a mixture of relief and awe in their eyes. As I stepped back into the quieter corridors, I understood that this formula represented both the pinnacle of scientific ingenuity and the shadow of human recklessness. The laboratory's secrets were not mere curiosities. They were powerful, unpredictable, and potentially catastrophic, a reality that defined every moment spent within these walls. A week later, I was assigned to observe the new biomechanical project, a secretive initiative aimed at creating advanced prosthetic limbs and augmentations for military personnel. The laboratory wing dedicated to this project was colder than the others, sterile and eerily quiet except for the soft whirring of servo motors and the faint metallic click of articulated joints. Glass cases displayed prototypes of artificial limbs, mechanical marvels designed with astonishing precision, yet simultaneously unnerving in their skeletal, almost lifelike appearance. Inside one of the chambers, technicians prepared animal subjects, primarily dogs and monkeys, whose limbs were to be temporarily augmented with mechanical prototypes. The procedure was methodical. Anesthetize, attach, calibrate, observe. I scribbled notes furiously, detailing the way joints flexed, the sensors responded, and how the animals adapted to the devices. There was a delicate balance between function and discomfort, and the team moved with both care and urgency, aware that a single error could harm the subjects or compromise the experiment entirely. Some of the augmented animals displayed surprising adaptability. A monkey adjusted quickly, manipulating levers with the added mechanical fingers, while a dog learned to balance on an artificially strengthened leg. Yet not all trials were successful. A few animals exhibited distress or unnatural movements, their bodies reacting poorly to the integration of metal and flesh. Observers immediately adjusted parameters, recording every detail, yet the room was heavy with an underlying tension. Each misstep was a reminder of the precarious line between innovation and cruelty. I overheard Dr. Fisher discussing the potential military applications with a colleague, speaking in hushed, almost reverent tones. He emphasized strength, precision, and endurance, the ability for soldiers to perform feats previously unimaginable. Yet even as he spoke of the promise of these devices, I noticed a shadow cross his face, a fleeting acknowledgement of the moral cost and the burden carried by those involved in creating these augmentations. The laboratory was as much a stage for ethical dilemmas as it was a workshop for scientific achievement. Later, as I observed the animals in a controlled simulation, the augmented limbs moving in rhythm with natural motion, I noted subtle complications: minor tissue strain, irregular nerve responses, and faint tremors in the mechanical joints. Every anomaly was documented meticulously, a record that combined scientific rigor with an uncomfortable awareness of the consequences of pushing boundaries too far. The brilliance of the engineering was undeniable, yet so was the gravity of its implications. By the end of the session, the animals were carefully removed from the equipment, tended to with antiseptic care, and returned to quiet enclosures. The room felt heavy with tension, the interplay of achievement and ethical compromise hanging in the air like an invisible weight. As I left the wing, notebook brimming with observations, I reflected on the nature of this work. Here, in these shadowed corridors, innovation, ambition, and morality collided, each experiment a delicate negotiation between progress and peril. That night, I recorded my reflections, trying to reconcile fascination with unease. The laboratory was alive, not merely with machinery, chemicals, or protocols, but with the ever-present reminder that human ingenuity, however brilliant, carried consequences that extended beyond the devices and compounds we manipulated, reaching into the lives of those, animal or human, who were touched directly or indirectly by the experiments conducted within these walls. In the days that followed, a new section of the laboratory captured my attention: the experimental aeronautics and rocketry wing. This area was larger, louder, and filled with a sense of controlled chaos, a place where theoretical physics collided directly with mechanical engineering. Metal frameworks for gliders, partial fuselages, and rocket prototypes were arranged across the halls, and the air hummed with energy, a mixture of electrical currents, fuel vapors, and human anticipation. The engineers worked in teams, constantly measuring, adjusting, and recalibrating devices designed to test new propulsion methods. One large assembly dominated the center of the wing, a prototype rocket partially enclosed in scaffolding, its cylindrical body bristling with valves, pipes, and instruments monitoring every variable. Technicians carefully attached fuel lines, checked pressure gauges, and reviewed flight trajectory calculations that had been revised countless times. The tension in the room was palpable. Every adjustment carried the risk of explosive failure. I observed a test involving a smaller unmanned rocket first. It was placed on a launch platform, restrained by clamps, with a series of sensors recording thrust, trajectory, and exhaust temperature. The countdown began, low voices murmuring the sequence as the clock ticked. When the ignition ignited, flames burst from the nozzle, propelling the rocket upward in a controlled arc. Sparks flew from the clamps as it detached, and the monitors recorded the soaring velocity and rotational stability. I jotted notes feverishly, documenting each reaction, vibration, and adjustment made in real time. However, the wing's experimental nature meant not all tests went smoothly. During a mid-sized rocket trial, a sudden pressure spike caused a burst of flames and a loud metallic bang. Engineers leapt into action, shutting valves, releasing excess pressure, and ensuring containment systems engaged correctly. The rocket, thankfully, did not detonate catastrophically, but the sound of escaping fuel and scorched metal filled the wing, leaving everyone momentarily frozen with a mixture of relief and fear. I recorded the incident in detail, noting the sequence of errors, corrective actions, and the subtle adjustments required to prevent future failures. Beyond the mechanical challenges, I noticed subtle social dynamics. Teams worked under immense pressure, their interactions a blend of camaraderie and tension. Engineers exchanged rapid-fire calculations, occasionally pausing to whisper warnings or suggestions, while supervisors monitored both human and mechanical variables. The laboratory itself seemed to pulse with urgency, each test a delicate dance of innovation, expertise, and risk management, where a single mistake could undo weeks of work or worse. By evening, after multiple successful and near-disastrous trials, the wing grew quieter. Prototypes were returned to storage, instruments recalibrated, and the faint smell of burnt fuel and ozone lingered in the air. I walked through the corridors, notebook filled, reflecting on the audacity of these experiments. Human ambition had once again pushed the boundaries, exploring flight and propulsion in ways that balanced wonder with danger. And yet, beneath the technical brilliance, a quiet fear lingered, the understanding that innovation in this laboratory often walked hand in hand with chaos, and that each experiment, no matter how controlled, carried the weight of unpredictable consequence. It was well past midnight when I returned to the aeronautics wing, drawn by reports of a minor anomaly in one of the larger rocket prototypes. The corridors were silent, dimly illuminated by the pale glow of overhead lamps, and the faint scent of fuel lingered heavily in the air. The wing felt different at night, quieter, more tense, as if the machines themselves held their breath, waiting for something to happen. As I approached the prototype, I noticed the subtle vibrations beneath my feet, almost imperceptible at first, then growing steadily. The rocket was mounted on its testing platform, valves and pipes attached, sensors blinking rapidly. A small pool of fuel had leaked near the base, its surface shimmering in the low light. I realized immediately that a misstep could result in catastrophe, the slightest spark igniting the volatile mixture. A lone technician was crouched nearby, frantically attempting to stabilize the pressure systems. The hum of machinery grew louder, accompanied by a soft, irregular hiss from the rocket's casing. I stepped forward, notebook in hand, but instinctively knew I had to help. Together, we adjusted valves, monitored gauges, and applied emergency containment protocols we had only ever practiced theoretically. The room seemed to pulse with urgency, the low vibrations aligning with the rhythm of our movements, each second stretching longer than the last. Suddenly, a sharp clang echoed as a loose pipe shifted, sending sparks across the metal floor. I ducked instinctively, heart racing, while the technician stabilized the pipe. Every movement was deliberate, each adjustment critical, the fine line between controlled testing and disaster razor-thin. I could feel the heat radiating from the base of the rocket, the energy contained within it like a coiled spring threatening to snap. Minutes felt like hours, yet finally the prototype stabilized. The vibrations subsided, the blinking sensors returned to steady patterns, and the hissing ceased. Both of us exhaled slowly, the tension in the room lifting just enough for relief to seep in. I recorded every detail, the sequence of malfunctions, the emergency measures taken, and the subtle behaviors of the rocket under stress. The incident left a lasting impression, reinforcing the omnipresent danger inherent in even the most controlled experiments within this laboratory. As I left the wing, the early dawn beginning to touch the horizon, I reflected on the delicate interplay of innovation and risk that defined every day in this place. The rocket prototype, with its potential for both achievement and catastrophe, symbolized the broader reality of the laboratory itself, a realm where curiosity, ambition, and danger coexisted, where every experiment carried consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the facility. The incident lingered in my mind long after I returned to my quarters, a stark reminder that observation alone was never enough. In this laboratory, understanding required vigilance, decisiveness, and a constant awareness of the fine lines separating discovery from disaster. And as I drifted into fitful sleep, I knew that tomorrow, like every day before, would present new experiments, new risks, and new glimpses into the extraordinary and often perilous world of human ingenuity. The following week brought me back to the Chemical Research Wing, where the laboratory's most secretive and potentially deadly experiments were underway. This section was heavily fortified, with reinforced doors and thick glass observation panels, and the air carried a sharp, acrid tang that stung my nostrils and lingered in my throat. It was a place designed for control, yet the sheer volatility of the substances within made caution paramount. Technicians were handling small vials containing compounds that shimmered unnaturally, some glowing faintly as though infused with energy beyond normal chemical reactions. Each substance had been labeled with cryptic codes rather than names, and the notation suggested complex interactions with organic and inorganic matter alike. I took meticulous notes, recording observations of colors, viscosity, and reactions to minute temperature changes. The faintest miscalculation could result in disaster. One experiment drew my attention immediately. A small chamber contained a mixture designed to release a controlled reaction when exposed to specific catalysts. The reaction was meant to demonstrate a chemical property that could be applied to fuel, propulsion, or even biochemical manipulation. As the technician carefully introduced the catalyst, a subtle but rapid change occurred. The mixture swirled violently, producing a glow that pulsed like a heartbeat and a faint hiss that grew steadily louder. I could feel the vibrations through the floor as the reaction intensified. Suddenly, the mixture emitted a small burst of energy, sending sparks along the chamber walls. The technician reacted instantly, adjusting valves, tightening seals, and recording the event with rapid precision. The air shimmered with heat, and I scribbled every observation, acutely aware that a single error could ignite a chain reaction far beyond the containment chamber. The experiment stabilized only after several tense moments, leaving the air heavy with residual energy and the faint odor of ozone and burned metal. While recording these events, I overheard fragments of conversation among senior researchers. They discussed potential military applications, the unpredictability of the reactions, and ethical concerns that were rarely addressed openly. Their words revealed a tension between ambition and responsibility, a constant negotiation between the desire to achieve breakthroughs and the awareness of the mortal danger these compounds represented. The laboratory, I realized, was as much a psychological crucible as it was a scientific one, testing not only the reactions of chemicals but the judgment and nerve of those who handled them. By the end of the day, I had documented the experiments thoroughly, my notebook brimming with data, sketches, and annotations. The compounds themselves, brilliant yet perilous, seemed to embody the duality of the laboratory, a source of incredible innovation and unimaginable danger, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge often demanded a willingness to confront forces beyond ordinary comprehension. As I left the wing, the quiet corridors seemed more ominous than usual. The chemical reactions, volatile and unpredictable, mirrored the hidden complexities of the laboratory itself, a place where brilliance, secrecy, and mortal risk were inseparably intertwined. That night, I reflected on the delicate balance required to navigate this environment. Every observation, every step, every choice carried consequences, and the shadows of the laboratory's secrets lingered in my mind, a constant companion to both awe and apprehension.